let's start. I'm Andrew Coulson. I was the chair of BTS. I worked in Tanzania a long time ago, so it's very much part of my life. I'd like to welcome everybody from all around the world, especially from within Tanzania, but also from other countries, including on the American subcontinent. We've got one sad thing to do, which is that I learned yesterday of the death of Simon Mbeleni, academic, senior civil servant, friend of Nyerere. They're also prepared to disagree with him. In fact, he features in the book that we're about to launch. So a very, very sad loss. We've lost other friends recently, including John Loxley, who will be known to many of you. That's another serious loss at a relatively young age. So I think the right thing that we should do is, those of us who can, to stand, and we'll have a minute's silence in memory of Simon and John and other people who we've lost in the last few months. Right, now we move on to more optimistic, interesting things. We have asked the three authors and the two discussants to be short. And there's a good reason for that, which is that we want to allow the audience to make as much of a contribution as possible. And the way you can do that is to write a comment or a question on the chat line, which on the computer version of Zoom is at the bottom of the page. So write your comments or your questions on the chat line. Ben Taylor is going to monitor them and work out the best order to have the questions and comments, and he will read them out. Some of them we can probably deal with very quickly, a single answer by one of the speakers. Others will introduce whole areas of discussion, and we'll then decide how to play it if that happens. Please, in what you're saying, bear in mind that most people won't have had the chance to read these three books. Not only is it sort of nearly 1,000 pages of reading, so even if you've got them, that's a major challenge, but the distribution is still only getting started, and so most people won't have had the chance to read the books. So both the speakers and the discussants and people asking questions need to recognize that. The way I put it is that this is the beginning of a journey, not the end. Or it's not quite the beginning. The journey has started with the book being written and published, but it's certainly not the end of the journey. And we don't know where that journey is going to take us, but we do know that it's a very important journey, that it will open up a whole series of questions about how Tanzanians and people around the rest of the world interpret the life of this amazing leader who took Tanzania to independence in 1961, was in some ways as much a philosopher and a thinker as he was a political leader, although he was very political as well. And the book brings out the balance. But how to interpret him, that is the really big challenging question which we're going to discuss now. And with that, I'll start by inviting Saida Yahya-Othman, who is the main author of the first volume, to start talking to us. Saida, you are most welcome.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Perhaps I should start by saying that one of the co-authors, I don't know if you know this, Andrew, Ngwaza Kamata, Dr. Kamata, is not able to attend because he's just lost his father-in-law. So he's in Beira actually attending the funeral, and he's very sorry to miss this event. So let me start by thanking the Britain Tanzania Society for giving us this opportunity to organize, to launch our book virtually. There's no other way now, that's the story in town, but particularly Professor Andrew Coulson for broaching the idea in the first place. Now, I think for several years after Mwalimu died, and several years definitely before we began thinking about the book, there's been a sort of a certain anticipation in the air, people expecting a comprehensive biography of Mwalimu. And I think Tom Moloney's biography of Nyerere's early years only served to fire that anticipation even more. Now, Mwalimu has been dead for more than 21 years, and most of the young people would only have heard of him. But their interest and their curiosity has been fired by this constant reference to Nyerere by the political class. So they must have been wondering, who is this father of the nation who so haunts the political class that they keep paying regular tribute at his altar, although as soon as they turn their backs, they start to malign him in their actions. So the biography is titled Development as Rebellion, and it's in 3 volumes. And that itself was a challenge that faced us at the beginning. But happily, we managed to overcome that challenge by each one of us taking 1 volume, 1 book, dealing with a particular aspect, a particular period of this very complex character. Now, Nyerere himself was a great storyteller, as some of you would know, but unfortunately, he didn't have he didn't get to write his own story. So we feel very privileged to have gotten that opportunity. And we had a very wonderful time doing it as well. Now, book 1, which I led, whose writing I led, is titled The Making of a Philosopher Ruler. And book 1, I think, is the one which took away the political from the title. Because when we started writing the biography, it was going to be a political biography. But as we started to develop the organization and the content of the book, we felt that there are very many aspects which people would not, which have not been covered so far, and which people might be interested in. So we had to drop the political from the title. And so now it's not a political biography anymore. So we aimed at achieving a rounded portrait of the man. A book that would cover not only the man's life, but also the trajectory of the nation, and how the image and the reality of one would have molded that of the other. Now, Nyerere himself said, men are shaped by the circumstances in which they live, a cliche in a way. But for Tanzanians, for 25 years after independence, Nyerere was the premier circumstance which shaped the way they lived, the way Tanzanians lived. I think he himself would probably deny that, and he would not, his legendary humility, I think, would not have allowed him to accept or to be credited with the degree to which his towering presence and thoughts fashioned the Tanzanian psyche. Now, Nyerere or Mwalimu, in the book we call him Nyerere to be sort of objective, but the fond term for him is Mwalimu. So Mwalimu was a chief's son, but he grew up in a very unchiefly environment. He did all the chores that village boys did. He herded goats until he reached the age of 12 when he went to school. And at that age, it was at that age that he got his first decent set of clothing. miner's shoes. Now, he prided himself in being a rebel. And I think his first rebellion was against his father when he converted to Christianity. His father totally opposed that, but Nyerere gave long thought to it, and eventually he became a Catholic. But even within the church, within the Catholic Church, he also became rebellious. And he was constantly railing against the rigid hierarchy of the Catholic Church, against the church's alliance with exploiters instead of the exploited, the alliance with the rich instead of the poor, the alliance with injustice instead of justice. And so this was a theme that he kept touching on in his addresses to religious congregations. He also rebelled against patriarchy very early on in his life. He wrote this amazing booklet in 1944 against the subjugation of women. And his attacks were mostly against bride price and polygamy. And he attacked the use of women as chattels who could be sold, who could be inherited by others when their husbands died, in the context of his own father having 22 wives and him growing up in a family of a lot of half brothers and half sisters. His own mother was not inherited, but his other stepmothers, his stepmothers were all inherited by various relatives when his father died. But he also acknowledged women's contribution later on, both in TANU, the party that he led, and also in the government by placing women in the Tanzanian cabinet. But his greatest rebellion, of course, was against the colonial edifice, which he was prepared for by the colonialists themselves by going to school at Tabora, which was a government school for sons of chiefs, by going to Makerere, and later on by going to Edinburgh University through following a very convoluted route, but eventually he got there. Now, the colonial administration thought that they were preparing him and others to come and do their bidding in the colonial administration. But actually, Tabora School turned out to be sort of a factory for Tanganyika's colonial rebels. So most of Nyerere's colleagues who later on became his ministers and his regional commissioners and so on, most of them actually studied at Tabora School. But what the colonialists least expected was that Nyerere would become a socialist. Although Nyerere himself would not use the word become, he would say that he always was a socialist. He was born a socialist. And sort of from the time he was born, socialism was stamped on him for all time. But he was a rabid, he was a socialist. He claimed to be a socialist, but he was a rabid anti-Marxist. Every opportunity he got, he attacked, criticized Marxism. And his main quarrel with Marxists was their rigidity. First of all, he never accepted that there were classes in Tanzania, but also he attacked the Marxists on their, what he called their Marxist jargon, that they just spewed this out without themselves understanding what it meant. It's interesting because he observes the same thing in relation to the Catholic Church, the rigidity, the repetition of what had been going on before for generations, the refusal to accept change and so on. But somehow it was all right for the church, but it was not all right for the Marxists. So Book One also looks at Nyerere's passion for Kiswahili, Tanzania's national language. And it was in Kiswahili that his oratorial prowess came to the fore, when he would talk for hours to a riveted audience on questions of at the time of the independence struggle, and also against the world economic order. And his audience would laugh at his humor. He was a very humorous man, and they would cry at his pain, especially in his speeches before independence. He came to translate Julius Caesar and Merchant of Venice in 1963, Julius Caesar, and it was extremely popular. It did extremely well. It sold about 11,000 copies in 3 years, which at that time was a huge number. And he often put his philosophical ideas, such as those of equality and freedom, in poetic form. At the time of independence, there was a tradition of poets writing in the Tanzanian papers, having a conversation with each other. So one poet would write on something, the other would respond, and then a third would come in, and so on. And Nyerere very often took part in this poetic dialogue through the papers. Before independence, Nyerere had lots of friends, and these friends held him up as a lovable, scholarly, supremely confident, worldly figure who could be comfortable in any situation and who could hold his own with any audience, with anybody. And this was to a large extent true, because Nyerere could heatedly argue with Ronald Reagan at Cancun, as he could decline an appointment with Richard Nixon, because he had already made an appointment with Maryknoll sisters. He could send IMF negotiators packing, but he could stop in the middle of a street. He could stop his entire convoy in the middle of a street so he could say hello to the mother of an old friend. He could shun the advice of his cabinet and accept that of a humble old man among his Tano elders. So he was a man of the people with hordes of friends before independence. But with the exigencies of his presidential position after he became president, he distanced himself from most of these friends, not because he didn't need them. He often complained how lonely he was, how he missed his friends, how he missed mixing with the public, but because he didn't want to become beholden to them. He didn't want to build an intimacy with them to a point where he had to do them favors. But his simplicity did not augur well for his family. He was so focused on what he called his national children that he tended to neglect his own biological children. And the children themselves did not know any better. They were the founding first family, so they had no idea that presidential children were supposed to be treated differently from others. But they had an even worse deal than other children, because not only were they not treated differently, but they did not even get the favors that the children of ministers used to get. So the State House could only function on the budget, on the meager budget that was given by the government. And this could only be used strictly for official business. You could not use this for going on a holiday or buying extra clothes and so on. Mama Maria used to raise chickens and stuff to augment the income of State House, because once Mwalimu moved to State House, the occupants grew greatly. People came from all over from the villages for children to go to school, others to visit, and so on. So sometimes there would be as many as 50 people in the house, and they all had to be fed, but the budget was the same. So Mama Maria was stopped by Mwalimu to do these extra duties. She could not even have the extra perk of being called First Lady. Nyerere would not hear of that. So she was simply Mama Maria. But I think Nyerere's most enduring quality is that the village never left him. In spite of his statesmanship, his scholarship, his being president for 25 years, the village always remained his campus.
Saida, just let me
Yes.
interrupt for a minute. We're running out of time.
I'm almost coming to
Another
the end.
2 or 3 minutes is okay.
Even one is enough.
Don't want to stop you too quickly.
Yes, I'm almost there. So he always returned to the village. He would sit under the shade of a tree and meet the villagers, his friends, his relatives, have a meal with them, play bao with them, exchange banter with them, and so on. And then early in the morning at sunset, he would proceed to his farm, his hoe in his hand, and start doing his farm work. And if you happen to have an appointment with him at that particular time, you went to Butiama to meet him and he was in the farm, then you were obliged to get a hoe yourself and join him in that endeavor. So as we will see in the introduction for books 2 and 3, Nyerere in practice, of course, strayed often from the straight path of freedom and social justice, but he remained true to his humble origins. He remained ordinary in spite of his extraordinary life. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Saida, so much. Can I just say that talk gives an insight into the depth, the level of detail which this biography, these 3 volumes have. And that is possible partly because of the range of sources that they've used. They've interviewed everybody that they could find who knew Nyerere at all well. So lots of really interesting interviews, and they've found archives that other people have not been able to use, especially Nyerere's own archive that was deposited in Butiama, in the study center in Butiama. So they've made a tremendous inroads. This is going to change the way we look at Tanzanian studies in the future because of the different sources. And out of that comes this very human individual struggling with his own demons as well as with all the problems of running the country. Now, I think we should go straight on and hear from Issa Shivji, as we can't hear from Nyangwaza Kamata, as I understand it. Issa, is that right? Are you happy to, in a sense, speak for both Nyangwaza and yourself in some way? What do you think's the best?
That's correct, yeah. Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you to Britain Tanzania Society for organizing this. It's very nice to see some of the old friends attending here, whom I've not met for a very long time. Actually, quite a few of them are referred to in our biography, including yourself. I also see Mzee John Hedge attending this. Very glad to see all those people attending. Now, straight away, let me go to sort of a kind of short highlighting of the book 2 and book 3. Since Gwanza is not with us, I'll have to do the book 2 as well. Now, if book 1 draws the portrait of the man, books 2 and 3 frame the portrait in historical and contextual contours of the country, with all its wrinkles and unseemly edges. At the outset, I must say that ours is not an ethnography or hagiography, but a biography, and hopefully rooted in the method of historical materialism. In the 2 chapters of book 2, chapter 5 and 6, Kamata shows with all the details how Nyerere was introduced to politics. It is not story of a single hero. Rather, it recognizes and documents with names and places the people involved in anti-colonial struggles from the time of Maji Rebellion 1905 to the formation of African Association 1929 in Tanganyika African Association, and later Tanganyika African National Union, TANU, under Mwalimu's leadership. In my view, the salience of this chapter lies in debunking official historiography, which depicts Nyerere as almost the sole founder of Tanzanian nationalism. It also brings out the role of Waswahili elders, many of them semi-literate Muslim elders of the coast, versed only in Arabic script, but great mobilizers and financiers of the movement. The chapter foregrounds the role of women in the struggle for independence against all the constraints of patriarchy and gender biases and prejudices. This is important in that both official historiography and many other writers at best discuss these two major political actors only marginally or in passing. Chapter 6 shows intense inter-petty bourgeois power struggles on the more of independence. It shows how the educated elite occupied the seats of power in the government, while the foot soldiers of the party were alienated. It shows the dashing of the great expectations of the masses. It tells the story of Nyerere's daring act resigning as prime minister only 6 weeks after independence. The book shows the two rival political centers, that is, the trade unions and the army. The struggle for power comes to a head only 2 years after independence. Between January and April 1964, 3 momentous events take place, which proved to be the turning points both for Nyerere as well as the political history of the country. The first was the Zanzibar Revolution. And Zanzibar, as you know, is on the doorsteps of Tanganyika, only 20 miles across the sea. Second was the army mutiny, which almost overthrew Nyerere's regime. And the third was the formation of the union between Tanganyika and Zanzibar, giving birth to Tanzania. The Zanzibar Revolution was born in the womb of Cold War, and therefore it immediately became a pawn in the Cold War, which Nyerere, then a moderate, wanted to avoid at all cost after the gruesome example of what had happened in the Congo. The interests of various forces converged in the formation of the union, which those of you who are curious should read in the book. The mutinous army was disbanded and a new army formed from party cadres, a major feat for any African country, because most African countries inherited colonial armies, and they have continued to be with the colonial armies with all its structures. Tanzania, I think, was the first African country to disband its colonial army and build its own army. The mutiny, ironically, also became an occasion for disbanding trade unions, for free trade unions, which were swallowed up by the state. They became state trade unions, and that was the beginning of the centralization of power and the creation of a party state. That's a kind of highlights of book 2, some of which you'll also find in book 3. In book 3, in its 6 chapters, it situates the Nyerere story in the political history and social struggles of the country. At the time of independence, and Mwalimu used to emphasize this, Tanganyika did not inherit a nation. It inherited a country with boundaries demarcated by the colonial state. So Mwalimu saw his primary task was one to build a nation out of a collection of diverse ethnic groups, what he himself called tribes. So Nyerere, for Nyerere, nation building project became the most important primary object. In fact, he was almost obsessed by it. And this runs through like a red thread in book 3, around which many of Nyerere's dilemmas, or what I would call contradictions and tensions, revolve. What was the agency for building the nation? The party could not be the agency because the party did not exist. This was an independence movement. It itself had to be built into a party. So the only agency available for Nyerere to build the nation was the state. So ironically, the colonial state was expected to build the nation. But the state itself had to be transformed. Mwalimu, particularly mutiny, gave him a jolt and began to think of this process. But the fact remained that throughout the state remained the agency to build the nation. And this had its own problems, as we shall see. Nyerere's imagery of nation was essentially Western, and he said it in so many words. We discussed this in the book. To shorten the matter, the effect of building the nation reduced itself to building a nation state, which is bureaucracy, security, and so on and so forth. I will group Nyerere's dilemmas or contradictions around 4 to 5 clusters. 1, national unity versus freedom. 2, unity versus diversity. 3, equality versus equity. 4, nation versus class. 5th is Pan-Africanism versus territorial nationalism. I'll not discuss this because hopefully that will be the subject matter of book 4 if and when it comes out. Now let me discuss Nyerere's dilemmas. The nation building project entailed by definition national unity. So you could not possibly allow centrifugal forces to disrupt your nation building project. This was Nyerere's first dilemma. And this meant that both individual freedoms and collective freedoms, like freedom of association, both had to be curtailed. And Nyerere, to use his own phrase, jolly well curtailed them. And this is discussed in chapter 7 of the book. The state set itself to establish its organizational hegemony, and after the Arusha Declaration, its ideological hegemony. The state became a highly centralized bureaucratic state. And very quickly, the opposition and centrifugal forces were reined in, ending up with a one-party system. Nyerere always argued, to his credit, that the one-party state was a pragmatic decision out of necessity at the time. It was not a philosophical decision. So here it is, freedom and necessity collided, and freedom gave way to necessity. The second cluster of dilemmas or contradictions revolve around the question of university versus diversity. By diversity, I mean ethnic, cultural, religious, and political diversity. Nyerere could and did countenance ethnic, cultural, religious diversity so long these did not become politicized or did not take an organizational political form and did not threaten his national building project. If you perceive that these diversities tended towards taking political form, he came down on them harshly and suppressed them. We have narrated in detail, for example, the saga of the East African Muslim Welfare Society, which was banned in 1968. The third cluster of contradictions revolve around the question of equality versus equity. Nyerere inherited a very unequal colonial society, and this inequality ran along racial lines. Now, if there is one thing which runs through Mwalimu's philosophy, it is the notion or the concept of equality, equality of all human beings. And for Nyerere, equality did not mean bourgeois equality or equality of opportunity. It meant equality of human dignity. I will not go into details, but in the book it is discussed, and I think this is a very important philosophical nuance to Mwalimu's concept of equality. Soon after independence, Nyerere's equality clashed with demands for addressing and redressing historical inequality. And this gave rise to very acrimonious debates, for example, on the citizenship issue, whether immigrant communities should be given Tanzanian citizenship, on the issue of Africanization of public service. So while it was tough for Nyerere to resist these demands, because he realized that equality among unequals is inequitable. Inevitably, this contradiction got entangled in the quarrel among politicians who had their own ambitions and agendas. And this partly led to his resignation as prime minister, which is discussed in book 2 and 3. Nyerere accepted that historical inequalities along racial lines were explosive and had to be addressed. But his argument was not through discrimination. Eventually, this dilemma and set of contradictions around them resulted in the adoption of the Arusha Declaration in 1967. Again, this is discussed at great length in book 3. Andrew mentioned some of the sources which we have used, and I feel, if I may be a bit immodest to say, we feel quite proud that from Butiama Library, we got a series of speeches in Swahili, which Mwalimu made just before the Arusha Declaration, because he had went down to regions, almost 16 regions, and these were reported in the nationalist paper as a long march before coming to announce the Arusha Declaration. Now, this has never been dealt with before in any writing as far as I know. Arusha Declaration was undoubtedly, as C.L.R. James said, a remarkable document coming out in the 20th century. But it had its own contradictions. Nationalization of means of production resulted in twofold expansion of the state and parastatal bureaucracy. And it posed a danger of the birth of a new class, kind of state bourgeoisie, what we at that time called the bureaucratic bourgeoisie. But Nyerere refused to recognize this. For Nyerere, Arusha Declaration was essentially a nationalist document and an important step in his project of nation building. So he would not allow any class or class struggle talk to disrupt his nation building project and national unity. That brings me to the next set of contradictions around the question of nation and class. What do you privilege? Or are there stages? First national liberation and then social emancipation. Now, this has been a dilemma of the left, including Marxist left, and national liberation leaders everywhere. But whereas others agonized over it, Nyerere was very clear from the outset. Nation takes precedence. National unity are to be privileged. And this meant a top-down process of implementing the Arusha Declaration. For example, although the Arusha Declaration said that the aim was to build a country of workers and peasants, and workers and peasants would be the beneficiaries of the Arusha Declaration, they were not the drivers of the process. The drivers were the bureaucracy. It was the bureaucracy which was in the seat, the driving seat. The process of implementing the Arusha Declaration was not simple or linear. The proto-bourgeoisie did face opposition from workers and workers' struggles, struggles of peasants, student struggles, but Nyerere suppressed them. Although Nyerere often said that he was trying to build socialism without socialists, or that development was a rebellion against the status quo. When rebels did arise in his own backyard, he suppressed them. He failed to see his allies. Instead, he sided with the bureaucratic bourgeoisie. So he did make choices. And I think that raises an interesting both philosophical and historical questions. I think this also informs the title of Book 3, Rebellion Without Rebels. Now, I must point out that
don't be too much longer or we shall run out of time. I don't want to push you too fast. Don't just stop, but another 5 or 10 minutes is okay, but no more.
Yes. Yeah, I should be able to finish it. I think I must mention that those who drum up all the time about the failure of Nyerere's project little understand the concrete situation, nor the struggles that went on in the country, both within and against imperialist interests in the country. So our biography consciously refused to either demonize or eulogize Nyerere. Instead, we wanted to situate him in the history of the country and the context of actually existing struggles. Now, so did Nyerere succeed in his project of building the nation? I would say yes and no. Yes, because Nyerere went furthest compared to many other African countries building nationhood, building a national identity, a national pride. But no, because it did not prove to be a nation, a durable nation state. When the neoliberal onslaught came in the 80s, the national edifice began to show cracks. Nyerere himself, in his 1995 speech, just before the 1995 election, recognized this and identified 5 cracks. I will not mention this. Since then, these cracks have widened. Now I want to add, given the constraint of time, by emphasizing 2 or 3 points of what I consider of general significance. One, by situating Nyerere in the context of the struggles and the discourses which develop within the country as a result, I believe we have tried to exploit 2 mythologies. The mythologies of a party as a monolithic organ, and the mythology that Nyerere was an omnipotent leader. Both are, neither is true. In fact, not even close to truth. There were internal struggles within the party at many stages, and these have been well narrated and analyzed in the book, as well as Nyerere did not always succeed. For example, we have given the example of the succession saga in 1985 after he declared that he was going to step down. Again, Nyerere did not get what he wanted. The second point that I would like to leave you with is that, having said that, it's undoubtedly true that Nyerere was a towering figure. And this raises a very interesting question. of both philosophy and history. The whole perpetual question of the role of individual in history. So I leave it to our participants to mull over this as they read the remarkable story of this great African, and undoubtedly one of the great persons of the 20th century. Thank you very much.
Issa, thank you very much. I'm sorry to cut you short a bit, but I'm sure that we're getting very much the feeling of it. I hope that what you're saying is going to encourage people to read for themselves, because there's no real substitute. You can't possibly summarize 350 pages in 20 minutes. It's just not the possible thing, but it gives people an idea. So we're going to move on now to have the two discussants, and then we'll open up to the wider discussion. Would you like to begin?
Hello, everybody.
We can hear you.
Oh, thank you. I'm very humbled to be a discussant to this event, and particular to the biography. It's very well written and very detailed biography, and I like how the biography, all 3 volumes, are easy to read, despite the fact that they are very well detailed. Yet it's very easy to follow everything from the beginning to the end, and it's not boring, which is very good. As Andrew, you mentioned, the sources are very impressive. I was looking at the endnotes and the different sources, and it's amazing how the 3 authors managed to do all that work. And with that, all of the 3 volumes are very objective and extremely well detailed. Saida said that it's not a political biography, and I actually agree. But I think book 2 and book 3 are I would say book 2 and book 3, volume 2 and volume 3 are actually political history kind of biography. But I really like the book 1 as well, because it brings into the picture the human side of Nyerere, which most of the time we don't get that image or that portrayal of Nyerere, in particular in Tanzania, because of how we have portrayed him, how he has been presented, and how he has been framed. So this book and all of the 3 volumes really bring a relief to most of the readers, and also to Tanzanians, of how we can view Nyerere as a human being, but also a great leader who is not an angel, which is really good. I also think that I really commend the fact that the authors published it at home. Is very impressive. Of course, I know that Mkuki na Nyota publishes extremely good books, and this is also very good, and I'm very proud of that. I think also the having 3 volumes was a very good idea, because I can imagine if it was one book, it would be a lot of pages, and this could not be easy for many readers. But one could read one book very independently, yet they connect with the other volumes, which is really good for writing skills and writing style. Also, I thought the book, the biography, was very good for even students of Tanzanian history, students who would like to understand the political history of Tanzania. But also, I think the book can help us to understand a lot of what is happening now. There's lots of changes which one can identify, but there's also some continuity. So we can see path dependency in terms of the political party, the party state, and a lot of social political discourse in Tanzania. At least by reading the book, a lot of things can be understood. At least this is what I found. There's lots of things that are happening, and I thought the book has helped me to think of them further. Also, I learned a lot about Nyerere that probably I didn't know before. For example, I thought the book bring him as a very pragmatic person. He was also a person who was ready to listen, even if he wanted, or he would ensure that his argument or his idea stands, but he would listen and give time before he can go back to put his own stance, which is very good. Something that a luxury that probably is not very much enjoyed with most political leaders. I also thought that book one is extremely relevant, even to thinking about women, the role of women. Also, out of my own research interest and background, looking at church and state relations. Also, how how the religion and religious institutions can attempt to influence politics and decisions, which is very well detailed. Also, the conceptualization of socialism by Nyerere, how he conceptualized it, how different he wanted to, how so much he wanted to differentiate it from Marxism, which came out so strongly in book 3. And I think this is something that many students and scholars of socialism also, or the left, or Tanzania, would like to understand, and I think it's important. Also, I thought okay, I would explain this, maybe give a little bit context. I recently wrote a biography, co-authored a biography of Bishop Erasto Kweka. He was a bishop of Tanzania, of ELCT, Northern Diocese. The book has just come out in November. And I kept, when I was reading Nyerere's earlier life in book 1, there's lots of context that you can actually relate. And I thought this is very important for us to understand how people who went generation, who made it to school, lived in different social dynamics that was happening in Tanzania. So this was very good to triangulate different sources and different information that we get from different even environment or cultural differences within Tanzania. So the context, how the book explains the context, I think it adds massively to our understanding of Tanzania, the modern history of Tanzania, and I would recommend the book to be read by all Mwananchi of Tanzania, but also students and scholars who would like to understand Tanzania. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Candy. I think that's a really helpful way of looking at it. There's so much good sense there. And I agree with every word you said myself. It's just how I reacted to the book is very much in the same way. Now, our final discussant is Professor Sam Wang. Is a very old friend of mine. He was the first master's student in the Department of Economics at the University of Dar es Salaam. And then later on in 2009, he made it possible for me to start coming back to Tanzania, and I wouldn't be here now if it wasn't for Sam Wang. So it's really lovely that he can also make his comments as a discussant on this amazing 3 volumes that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andrew. Good evening, everybody.
Hi.
It is nice. My internet is not very stable. Hello? Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Thank you very much. I can't have done a job, and I appreciate. Let me appreciate very much the 3.
Can I ask everybody to turn off their video in order to try and get more bandwidth? Because otherwise we won't hear Sam.
Okay. I'm saying for a long time we have missed the autobiography of Nyerere, written in such an analytical way, which actually represents also the history of Tanzania during that period. So it's Nyerere as the subject here, but the volumes and the way they've been presented actually shows very analytically the history of Tanzania, political, economic history of Tanzania. So it's a book which to me feels a very important gap, especially since in many ways Nyerere is sometimes cited out of context without actually capturing the comprehensive analysis and contradictions he was facing as the volumes have shown. I would like to wish there was more emphasis on how Nyerere handled the balance between economic policy and social policy. Too many people too quickly, not in this book, judge Nyerere's economic policy as having failed. But this is a failure to balance what actually Nyerere balanced very well between economic policy and social policy. Did not separate them, as we saw in by the Bretton Woods institutions in the 80s, where the emphasis was economic policy and later social policy. Development is not a situation where you do one at one time and then do another at that time. He balanced them so well all through. I think this is a credit which it hasn't come out very well. I hope it's an issue which can come up in volume 4. Nyerere was very much ahead of his time when he was talking of shared growth. You address sectors which address poverty most. That's where his first emphasis was on agriculture, saying since at that time of independence, 95% of the population was in agriculture. You must deal with agricultural productivity first in order to raise incomes in agriculture. And this is the story one hears much later in the 90s and 2000s, as if it is new. But this is something which Nyerere discovered and articulated very well from the early 60s. Nyerere, what he articulates what he really stood for in terms of participation and accountability. The importance of people themselves determining their own destiny, having a say in decision-making processes, and the importance of holding the government accountable. Accountability was very much underscored in his discourse. This is an issue which is maybe, I'm not sure to what extent it's raised in the volume. In the presentations, it's not coming out very clearly. And I've not been able to read all the 3 volumes since I knew about this assignment. However, participation and accountability, I think, are very important attributes of what Nyerere could be appreciated. The issue of economic empowerment was very much in Nyerere's mind. And the idea about the Arusha Declaration, nationalization, was attempts to achieve economic empowerment, especially for the underprivileged groups in the society. So this one is an issue which actually deserves credit for having addressed economic empowerment in that sense. The issue which Nyerere deals with very innovatively, I think, is the issue of freedom. He interprets freedom in terms of the freedom to determine our own destiny and shape our own future, which again links well to self-reliance and his interpretation of economic independence. Nyerere on freedom is emphatic on freedom from hunger, freedom from poverty, freedom from disease. I think these three freedoms, again, all through demonstrated how he balanced economic and social policy, all through. The third type of freedom which he addresses quite well is freedom to have dignity and equality. The concept of equality, I think Shivji has addressed it quite well. But fourth was in terms of putting people at the center of development and emphasizing human development, an issue which he addressed well in the 60s. The UNDP came to discover it in 1990, saying human development is beyond the GDP. Human development is an important aspect of development. This is something which was articulated very well by Nyerere in the 60s. But finally, as Shivji says, maybe Pan-Africanism, regional economic integration is a subject to be dealt with in the next volume. And he saw this as regional economic integration as South-South cooperation or cooperation among the developing countries was to him politically collective bargaining or strengthening position in the world economy. So it was a strategy to see developing countries strengthen their position in the world economy. So overall, I see the volumes capture very wide ground, and they really help to interpret Nyerere in the context of many contradictions which he had faced. He was a very powerful individual, but he was a person who debated his way through. He did not push people through what he wanted, but there was a lot of debate in what he was doing, and where it was he deemed it appropriate, he allowed himself to be defeated. Not all time did he force himself to win in the debate. So he was clear about what he wanted, but he also had challenges of pushing his arguments through, engaging in debate. Remember how he was visiting the university, actually engaging in debates with everybody in the area. So congratulations to the team for having done an excellent work, have filled a very void environment. In the last 21 years, we have not seen anything that comprehensive about Nyerere. I think it does real justice on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam, for that. That's also very interesting comments. And thank you, everybody that's spoken. Now we're going to have some time for more widespread discussion. Can I hand over to Ben Taylor, who's going to take us through this part of the event?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all three authors, the two of you who are here today, and also to Mwanza. I read the book over a few weeks over the summer, the British summer. Loved it greatly, found it fascinating, constantly learning new things about important aspects of Nyerere and Tanzanian history as a whole. As you said, Andrew, I've been asked to take us through a few questions that have been coming up. We've had quite a few questions already in the chat. I encourage anybody who's got their questions to use the chat function on Zoom, and we have nearly an hour still to go, so we have plenty of time to go through some questions. Let me start with a couple of just comments. One from George Hadjiavanis, commenting particularly to Issa Shivji, saying trade unions played a very significant role during the independence struggle, but Nyerere had to do away with them. They'd become an obstacle towards his ambitions of building a nation. This had lasting consequences, however, as workers could no longer struggle for their own working class interests. A second comment from Isaac Mdindile, just commenting that Nyerere made sure his government and his closest associates reflected as much as possible a cross-section of Tanzania's diverse society, different religion groups, different ethnicities as well, which I think is a useful point. I'm not going to go through all the questions that we have at this point straight away, because we have, as I say, quite a lot, but let me start with 4 questions. One from Shirumisha Kwayu, who is curious to understand how Mwalimu's legacy is embedded in the current social political situation in Tanzania, and how would Nyerere perceive the current situation in Tanzania? I think that's a question that many of us would love to hear the author's views on. A second question, one from Kevin Curley, specifically about the decision to make Swahili a national language, asking whether there were alternatives considered, in particular whether pushing English hard was ever considered as an alternative to Kiswahili. A question from Lawrence Cockcroft. Was the decision to leave the East African community consistent with Mwalimu's concepts, philosophy, and so on? And I'll just add one more question before handing back from Tim Hunt. Tim writes about Che Guevara's activities in Tanzania, particularly traveling across Tanzania to the Congolese shore of Lake Tanganyika in the mid-60s, asking whether the authors have included this discussion of this activity, this event in the book, and Nyerere's presumed awareness of Che Guevara's activities in the Congo and traveling through Tanzania, and what support, tacit or otherwise, Nyerere gave to Che Guevara in that situation. Let me hand it back then to Andrew and to the authors to answer those questions, and I will keep looking through for more questions as they come in. Thank you.
Saida, would you like to start? Because I know certainly on the Swahili one, you've got a lot to say, I know, in your book.
Yes, thank you very much, Andrew. I'm not sure what period who was it who asked this question was referring to, but definitely at the beginning after independence, there was no question of English becoming a contestant with Swahili, for the simple reason that the people had seen in demonstration the way Kiswahili had been used in mobilizing the people for the independence struggle. Mwalimu and his colleagues used to go around the country addressing people, and I think there were only 2 places where he had to use an interpreter. But in all the other places he visited, he could use Kiswahili directly and people could understand him. And this, of course, comes from the history of, unfortunately, the plantation economy that we had gone through, that people were moving, especially the men, were moving from one region to the other to work in the plantations and so on. And so they carried the language with them. And even when they returned home, this language then, Kiswahili, that is spread throughout the country. And it was obvious that it was extremely important in the nation building project. And Nyerere was very conscious of this. But we also have to remember that at the time of independence, there were very few Tanzanians who were educated to be able to understand English. Of course, it was the language that they were using in the Legislative Council and in the early years, but very early on in Parliament, Vice President Kawawa announced that Swahili was going to be the national language. Now in Tanzania, we make a distinction between the national language and the official language. So English continues to be the official language, and Kiswahili is also an official language, but it is the only one which is the national language. So at that time, there would have been very little opposition. But now, of course, there's been a pull for the last, well, since independence, the struggle to make Swahili the medium of instruction in school is always meeting opposition from mostly, of course, the educated class, the middle class, because they themselves speak English. They send their children to English-speaking schools, and this is becoming more obvious now. There are families who speak nothing but English in their homes, okay, which is extremely mortifying for me anyway, but this is the truth now. So it continues to be the national language, and fortunately with the current government, there is a great emphasis on the use of Kiswahili, both as a national and an official language. So most government business is run in Kiswahili, but still there is this resistance of using Kiswahili as a medium of instruction in government schools. Thank you, Andrew.
I can't resist saying that there's a whole chapter on Swahili in Saida's volume 1, and it's one of the most original bits of the whole study. And anybody that's interested in these questions, it breaks new ground in all sorts of directions, especially looking at the way that Nyerere used the language, and the way that, especially in his translations of Julius Caesar and other and Shakespeare plays, even Plato's Republic, he was translating even up to his death. So very great interest in Swahili. But anyway, let's move on to Issa again for the other questions that were raised.
Okay, just a few comments. On the comment from George on trade unions, he is right about the way trade unions were destroyed, the organizational expression of workers from which they have not yet recovered. But what is interesting is that from 1971 to about 1974, there was a massive working class struggle. And in those struggles arising from the bottom, the workers bypassed trade unions, the official trade union, as we all know. And this has been documented very well. So even in the absence of trade unions, the workers were able to organize and carry out the struggle, which eventually was suppressed, and Mwalimu actually gave his blessings to that. Now that has been discussed in book 3. 2 or 3 other questions. To what extent Mwalimu's legacy is embedded in the current situation? Short answer. It is embedded in the form of a Mwalimu being turned into an icon and a statue which you garland without necessarily taking into account or implementing what he thought about. Was Mwalimu's withdrawal from Islamic community consistent? No, it wasn't. And he agonized over it. And this has been documented in the book. He was not pleased to have to take that action. He was not pleased at all. He agonized over it, but we must not forget that it made almost impossible, particularly by Kenya, for Mwalimu to continue to be in the East African community. There's a question on Che Guevara. This would be dealt with in book 4 when we eventually come to write book 4, because it relates to issues of foreign relations. Maybe we can now go on to second set of questions.
Hi, yes, thank you very much for those responses. Just to take us through some more questions then. We've had a few questions about the books themselves. In particular, a question from Maria Soriano asking if the authors can talk us through the genesis of the project that produced these books. They're clearly a major undertaking to produce such a groundbreaking or a biography of such a significant figure. So it would be interesting to understand more about how the books came about. And a related question perhaps from Aikande, asking two questions that she forgot to raise when she was responding. Firstly, when is book 4 expected to come out? And second, is there any prospect of a Swahili translation of the volumes? So there's a couple of questions just on the books themselves. Maybe I could just ask you to respond to those, and then we'll come back to some of the politics and the economics afterwards.
Issa, is that best you to take that on, and then let Saida add to what you want to say?
Okay, on the question of genesis of the project, interesting question. Partly spontaneously, but partly I think our experience when the 3 authors were involved very heavily in organizing the activities of the Mwalimu Nyerere Chair in Pan-African Studies, which was established at the University of Dar es Salaam in 2008. And it brought home the point that the new generation knew very little about Mwalimu, and particularly because we had gone through the decade of 80s where Mwalimu directly, indirectly was highly demonized as a failure in his years. And I think this brought home to us the importance of doing this project. And at the right time, we got support from the Tanzania Commission of Science and Technology, financial support, because for this project, we did not take any money from funders outside. The project was funded by Tanzania Commission for Science and Technology, and the conditions were very clear. They would fund the project, but they would have no say on what we write or the way we do it. And they would have no say in reading the draft, and they respected that until the book came out. Then the 3 of us worked together in the Tanzania Science Commission on National Resource Center. So all that helped us, for example, to come together and exchange views and also work together on the project. We must say that, yes, indeed, the project was ambitious. And we did not realize when we embarked on it how ambitious it was. And, but eventually, we are happy that we managed it. And as you have seen, the massive research that was done resulted in writing 3 volumes. And one of the challenges that we faced very early on, after drafting the first chapters, was that we could not possibly have a biography with 3 authors. Because originally we had thought that we would be able to write chapters, different people, and then harmonize. And that proved to be virtually impossible, both in terms of the style and nuances, the idioms used, and also in some cases approaches and theoretical points of view. So we hit on this idea of having 3 books, with each book having a lead author. And the lead author means that although the book was drafted by one author, others did go through it and made comments, some of which were taken on board, and therefore the books were improved on that basis. There is a question by Kande on book 4. Well, where we are at. It's very difficult to say. The pandemic has been a terrible interruption, number 1. So although there is a plan, I would not, it would be hazardous for me to venture into any timeline on book 4. On the question of Swahili translation, well, I think that is the job we'll have to leave to your generation, Aikande, to attempt a translation. Although my advice would be that it is not amenable to literal translation. But based on this work, I'm sure you can write a Swahili version of the biography, and that would be very welcome. I don't know if Saida wants to add anything to that.
Saida, yes.
I think you've covered it. I think a Swahili translation, it would have to be an abridged version of the biography, because I think 1,000 pages in Kiswahili would be a huge project. And I'm not sure that there would, I'm sorry to have to say this, but I'm not sure that there would be the readership for it to warrant in that size, I mean, to warrant the publication of a translation. But if I could just touch on the genesis of the book, I must say that for me, it's been a very personal project, because this is my first ever book. I've never written a book before. So when we were talking about this, and the idea came up that I could be one of the authors, I said, "What? Who? Me?" And after some persuasion, I agreed, because mostly because this had been a project very close to the heart of my late husband, Harub Othman. He was planning to write it before he died, and he had already talked to Mwalimu, and Mwalimu had agreed that he should be part of the team to write the book. So that basically was the only reason that I got into it. But now that I've done it, I'm glad I did it. Thank you.
I'm sure you are, and I'm sure it was a very, very good decision. Ben, back to you.
Thank you. Yes, a few more questions. Some questions about Mwalimu himself. A question in particular from Dorcas Robinson. To what extent have the books been able to integrate self-reflections from Mwalimu himself? Are there sources to support this? I guess that's referring to whether Mwalimu was able to be critical of some of his own failures, we could say, in some ways, maybe in economic terms, maybe even in political terms. And a similar, perhaps related question from Shirumisha for Saida. What key lesson can African leaders and citizens learn from the early and personal life of Nyerere? And then I'll add one more question before handing back from Leo Zelig. There are stories of Nyerere walking by himself through the campus of the University of Dar es Salaam in the 60s, stopping to talk to students and staff. And Leo's asking if this is a true reflection of his approach in this period. In particular, Leo notes that later debates with staff and students were very different, expelling and arresting student rebels, enforcing a hard line on the parameters of debates. And Leo's interested in how the panelists explain this conflicted approach. And just to add to that, Leo also asks that among the most strongly worded criticisms of Nyerere's approach at the time actually came from one of the authors, Issa Shivji. And Leo is asking how Nyerere responded to the critiques of Shivji and others. And did he engage with those critiques at the time? Thank you.
Issa, I guess you take those on first, and again, we'll let Saida add to it if she wishes.
Sorry. On the question, the two questions of Leo, first on the debates and is Nyerere's conflicted approach. I think there is a slight nuance to it. So long as the debates remained within the university, Nyerere tolerated them. But if the debates spilled over to the streets, particularly in organized form, Nyerere came out against them. The specific example that Leo gives of Walter Rodney, that's an interesting issue because it was based on the paper that Walter read to the Conference of East and Central African Youth Leaders Conference. And his paper was interpreted as arousing the students to critique and overthrow their own governments. And that is one thing that Nyerere could not accept. That for people to interfere directly on foreign policy issues, because I said that Nyerere was obsessed not only with national unity, but also with African unity. He kept saying that he was African first and socialist second. In fact, there's another incident where Frenny Jinwala was the first editor of the nationalized newspaper, The Standard then, which is now called Daily News. When she wrote an editorial on Nyerere after the coup, she was immediately fired by Mwalimu because it was a foreign policy issue. Nyerere was about to visit Tanzania and he could not tolerate a government paper making a very harsh critique of another African leader. On the question of Mwalimu's reaction to my book, Class Struggle in Tanzania, it's difficult to say, but there is one exchange at the University of Dar es Salaam, which is not directly, but obviously tangentially refers to class struggles, which has been covered at great length in book 3. So you might want to read that. I think the other question was on integrating self-reflection by Mwalimu. Well, there are some critiques, self-critique of Mwalimu. For example, on the abolition of cooperatives, where he admitted the mistake, on the abolition of local government, okay? And also the problems of import substitution industrialization. These are all three debated at the University of Dar es Salaam, and in 1977, Mwalimu in his speech admitted that these were mistakes. So there is that, and which has been dealt with in the books. Yes, thank you.
Saida, do you want to add to that, or should we move on?
Well, just a couple of words on the issue of what would current leaders learn from Nyerere's early life. I think they have quite a lot to learn, especially in the, if I may dare to say, in the current government. I think the issue of humility, that leaders and humility and service to the people, that they are leaders, they are there to serve the people and not to serve themselves and their families and so on. This is becoming a big problem. Also the avoidance of mediocrity. Nyerere was forced to appoint some mediocre officers because he had no, as he himself said, that was the pool from which he had to pick. There were very few people at that time who were educated, but now there's no reason to do that. And also the question of the avoidance of ostentation. Nyerere simplicity meant that he, this question of traveling with long convoys of cars and the sirens blazing and people having to stop for hours on the road in order for leaders to pass and so on. I think all those, but of course, the most important is the question of having a vision of where the country wants to go. Now we are claiming that we are not capitalists, but all our systems, all our policies are nothing but capitalist policies. But we keep on claiming that we are keeping Nyerere's vision of socialism in mind. I think those might be some of the important lessons to be learned by the current leaders. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me take us on to some more questions then. We have several questions which I'm going to group together on economic matters, in particular one from Mohammed Wasame, asking about the economic failure of Ujamaa. We've already discussed the abolition of the cooperatives. There's other issues as well, though, the Ujamaa villagization, the impact on farmers and on agricultural production, the extractive maintenance of overvalued exchange rates, uncontrolled parastatals, excessive external borrowing, and refusal to restructure the economy as structural failures became apparent. Mohammed disagrees with the professor here. The balance of economic and social as justification does not really justify the scale of the economic collapse as the country underwent. Social gains by the early 80s started to collapse back due to the unsustainable economic situation. And coming to a question there, how does book 3 cover the shortages and economic pain of the early 80s and the contradictions of setting prices and laws against economic sabotage, etc., that led to significant distortions, dislocations in the economy? And then a related question, I guess, from Anthony Ellman. The forced villagization program is described in volume 3, chapter 9, indicating that despite Nyerere's oft-stated commitment to voluntary move to socialism, he accepted the need for the state to impose its will on a reluctant peasantry. Can he really have been unaware of the negative impact that this campaign would have, social, economic, environmental, or did he consider the political gains would outweigh these negative impacts? Thank you.
I think we could ask Issa to comment on that, but I think we could also ask Sam Wang for his views on that, because he's been involved in the economic side of it for the whole of his life.
Okay, let me start and then Sam can come in. The question about economic failure for Ujamaa, frankly, I think this has become a cliche. I think you must read volume 3. What does it mean when you say economic failure for Ujamaa? There are very few Ujamaa villages to start with. Very few Ujamaa villages. Most villages were what later came to be called development villages. And when forced villagization took place, it was not to build Ujamaa villages. It was simply to move into villages, and the villages were called development villages. So when you talk about failure of Ujamaa, I don't see there the failure of Ujamaa. But I think the weakest, the underbelly of our economic direction and policy during Mwalimu's time was lack of understanding of our rural sector and agriculture. The peasant was sucked dry, surplus was siphoned off. It never returned to agriculture for development. And this has been again discussed in book 3, and Sam can add to it. I think that is where our failure lay. There's a question about forced villagization. Didn't Mwalimu see the possible impact of it? What is interesting is that in the course of our research, we came across a speech made by Mwalimu to TANU Youth League branch of the University of Dar es Salaam. And he precisely raises this dilemma that while we are advocating voluntary movement into villages for rural development, you can easily get party zealots who will try to push people into villages. And what will happen then? So he poses the dilemma, and this is you can see almost throughout the book. Mwalimu sees the dilemma, Mwalimu sees the possible, and then makes choices. Very interesting enough. Someone has called him pragmatic. Yes, there are pragmatic choices, but Mwalimu had the great ability to justify his pragmatic choices and pragmatic decisions by principles. And here, if one wants to raise slightly on a more abstract philosophical level, we constantly see the tension between freedom and necessity. Constantly we see that, the way Mwalimu saw it. Does that mean that Mwalimu was all the time driven by objective necessity and no choices? No, that's not true. There are turning points where Mwalimu did have choices, which you could have made. There are possible alternative paths, but Mwalimu did not make those choices. What does that mean? I think to be able to answer that question, we should go back to our method. Unless we raise Mwalimu above his society and make him an angel, we cannot really answer that question outside the context of the struggles and the social forces at work. I think we should keep that in mind. On the question of, yes, shortages and so on, I would recommend to Mohammed to read volume 3, the crisis of the early 1980s that is talking about, the shortages, the Economic Sabotage Act, all that has been dealt with in great detail. On the question of exchange rate, the whole question of exchange rate and the struggle with IMF cannot simply be seen in economic terms. This was a political question. It was a question of the sovereignty of the nation. And monetary sovereignty is one of the important indices of a sovereign state. And Mwalimu saw this as a political point of view, that whether or not we make our decisions or not, I think that was the issue at stake. So Mohammed, I will suggest to you that don't see this question as a purely economic. There is definitely a political part of it. Many of the decisions, the whole struggle with IMF was also a political struggle. Yes, that's it.
Sam, are you there?
Yes, I finished, Andrew. I think Sam was going to.
Yes, Liv. Yes, Liv. Okay. Yes, the one comment was made on the economy. Nyerere was very emphatic about the importance of learning from our own mistakes and from mistakes of others. He never pretended to have not made any mistakes. So it's he's cited for having written where we had made mistakes and where corrections could have been made. However, what is seen as a correction of mistakes by the IMF World Bank in the late 80s, 90s. If you put Tanzania in a situation like where we were in the 70s and 60s, and 70s in particular, all the same position as Vietnam. Vietnam managed to stand firm and retain the core of the economic policies under socialist regime. And they relaxed gradually in a way in which they built on the achievements which they had made in the 70s. In Tanzania, we lost the struggle and threw the baby with the bathwater. The capabilities which had been built in the 70s, we were lured into abandoning them in the structural adjustment programs. So you have a situation where you are building an economy or in a vacuum almost, in having lost the capabilities of the 70s. Nyerere was very clear, saying, for instance, in case of nationalization, why do you want to nationalize wholesale? You can support private sector development, supporting to establish new establishments, but why do you want to sell parastatals to the private sector? A situation which had been again or had been a political decision to empower the Tanzanians through parastatals. And adjustments could have been made as Nyerere had argued. I agree with Shivji that issues of price controls and exchange rate are not the primary issues at debate. The exchange rate had already started to be relaxed from the 82, 83, 84. The price controls had started to be relaxed already by 384. So they were not the key issues of debate in the debate between IMF and World Bank. After all, following the abandonment of the social policies of Nyerere, in the 90s, the whole world comes back to social policy from the Copenhagen summit, coming back to the social policy. From the 80s, 90s, 2000s, the PRSPs are all mainly about social policy. So dealing with social policy, economic policy on the one hand, and another period, economic policy, this is disruption of the economy. So if Nyerere's argument about rectifying, learning from the mistakes of the 70s had been followed, would not have been in such a disruptive situation. But I would, that stimulates me to write, in detail what I argue that Nyerere's economic failure was not as what is actually painted in the picture. It's a normal, in a pragmatic way, you correct mistakes as you go. It would have been a normal way of correcting mistakes as we go, but we are brought into disruptions which actually erased all the most of the capabilities which had been created in the 70s instead of building on them to pragmatically adjust into the new situation. So I still don't agree with you, Mohammed, but let's continue this debate probably in greater detail in maybe in volume 4.
Thank you, Sam. I mean, it is an interesting. There's written about the structural adjustment in Tanzania, and both by outsiders and by Tanzanians, and nobody, I think, is satisfied with what did actually happen, because Tanzania went from one extreme to the other, and it probably got the worst of both worlds. But I'm not sure that this is the book which is going to shed a lot more light on that particular thing. In contrast to the discussion of Ujima in volume 3, which I think is absolutely excellent, and I would commend anybody that raising questions about villagization and what actually happened to actually get hold of that section, because it's really very, very much more in depth than anything else I've seen, and much more uses a wider range of sources, as does the discussion in volume 1 of the University of Dar es Salaam, which is also absolutely fascinating. I think Saida has broken really important new ground in that. But on the economic things, I'm not sure. I think it's hard to actually understand that part of Tanzanian history just as through a biography of President Nyerere. That's my comment. I don't know, Saida, whether you want to come in there, or should we go on to something else?
Let's continue, please. Hello? Let's just continue, please. Did you get me, Andrew? Yeah, I was suggesting that we continue.
Yeah, let me pose a couple more questions then from those raised in the chat. Thank you, Saida. I think we've touched on most of the questions that have been raised. I haven't put every question forward that's been posed in the chat, but I think we've touched on most of the topics. Just a couple more that I think it would be useful to go through. one that was asked earlier, but I think maybe we could expand on further, from David Ackland. How would Nyerere view the current oppression of political debate and, as he puts it, election rigging in Tanzania, I assume in Tanzania? And a question from Maria Soriano, asking to take us back a little bit earlier, back before the 1960s to the 1950s, when there were people like Abdul Wahid Sykes, who were kind of prominent in the nascent independence movement, such as there was in the early days. Maria refers to largely semi-literate Wazee wa Mijini, successful businessmen. And she's asking how they came to choose a young school teacher wearing shorts, Nyerere. Was that pragmatism on their part, recognizing his education and seeing that that was something that could bring about independence? She's curious to understand that period and the role of prominent Muslim men in particular at that time. Thank you.
Saida, would you like to take that one on, and then Issa could take it the other way around?
Well, I think that's a story that's been told in great detail in Mohammed Said's book on the life and times of Abdul Wahid Sykes. I think there is no there's no denying the great contribution that was made by both Muslim men and Muslim women of the likes of Bibi Titi in the early phases of the struggle. And whether Nyerere was given, there was an election. There was an election to become the leader of TANU, and whether Nyerere was given that post because he was educated or not, but there are others who are also educated, his contemporaries in Makerere, in fact. But the stories that Mohammed Said tells was that it was a sort of a coup that was instigated at the time by a small group of people against others like Abdul Wahid Sykes, who might have been considered the natural leader. There's even a story that the Muslim men, when Nyerere had been elected, sat on the veranda and cried in pain at what had happened. But there's no doubt also that there was Nyerere had received great support from because the men of the town were mostly Muslim. The traders, the business people, most of them were Muslim, and they were the ones who supported Nyerere when he came over, when he left his job as a school teacher, and he had no salary from TANU, and therefore they provided, they basically ran his household and provided food to his family, provided him with transport and so on. So he would not definitely have been able to get to the position that he did without the support of these Muslim men and Muslim women as well. It's sort of assumed that, you know, in order for you to have, for the women at least, for you to have taken part in the struggle, you would have to be in the front line, okay, and be arrested and put in jail and so on. But most of the Muslim men and Muslim women were in the background, but they were doing very important jobs of supporting the struggle in terms of supporting the men, supporting the meetings that were taking place. So Nyerere, for instance, would attend a Tarab session, and during that, the women would sing, but during that session, a meeting would be taking place as well. So a lot of people think that Mohammed Said perhaps has gone too far on the Muslim side, but there's also a lot of truth in what he has described in his book. The contribution of the Muslims who are Nyerere's hosts in Dar es Salaam is absolutely undeniable. Thank you.
Issa, do you want to come in now? I think after that it would be good for I Kelly, if she has anything to say in commenting on anything which has been said since she's made her own comment earlier on. But Issa first.
Okay, I think there were three things that I saw on the question of Nyerere's attitudes towards a peaceful nation. I think it is to be emphasized again and again that Nyerere said that you cannot have peace without justice, and he kept emphasizing that. And this very interesting speech he made, which has never been published. It was published in a newspaper and they're forgotten, where he discusses the role of Arusha Declaration on the question of giving people hope. And he says that the day people lose hope, you will not be able to maintain peace. And you cannot have peace without justice. So on that, I think there is a lot of reflection and writing by Mwalimu. There's another question on the question of the, I think it has something to do with to elaborate on election rigging. Now, much of Nyerere's 25 years in the government was a one-party system, but he was keen that elections must always take place on time every 5 years. In that election, there was no choice of the president except to say no. And there were people who said no or yes. And the question of parliamentary elections, there was a choice between two members of the same party. But it's also interesting to note, in spite of the one-party system, in spite of the fact that you are choosing between two members of the same party, it was during Nyerere's time that some of the big shots were defeated, number one. And number two, it was during Nyerere's time that even those who won were declared on a petition to the court to use some corruption, and therefore they were unseated by the courts, including who was then the Prime Minister, Mr. Joseph Warioba. So those are very interesting things. And we had election petitions during the one-party system. I think more election petitions than you're likely to have today. There was one question by Zarina on the Nyerere's attitude to Zanzibar and imprisonment of Babu. This is again where the question of unity comes in. For Nyerere, the union between Tanganyika and Zanzibar was a sacred cow. And therefore he had to make lots of compromises on that issue. He had to make lots of compromises, including the detention of Babu. But to his credit, he did not send Babu back to Zanzibar. But in the process, Babu lost 6 years of his liberty because he was kept in prison. This is discussed in book 3, chapter 7. It's also interesting that when he was stepping down in 1985, and he went around, and one of the most scathing speeches that he made was on the question of Zanzibar, and how after the revolution, the leaders of the revolution resorted to some kind of tyranny. That has been covered in book 3 as well. That's it. I don't know.
Kelly, have you anything you'd like to contribute at this stage about the whole discussion that we're having?
Okay, I'm very grateful. I think that this discussion was extremely good. The questions were very on point and they were answered properly. And I would just recommend everybody to read the book, all of the 3 volumes, to understand more so as to avoid misunderstanding Nyerere, but also to really avoid misuse of Nyerere and be able to understand the political history of Tanzania so that we can understand what is happening now. Thank you so much for.
And thank you as well. I'd like to ask the two main speakers, is there anything you'd particularly like to emphasize or develop a little bit more on the matters that have been raised? Anything you'd like to add? There's no need to add anything at all unless you want to, but is there anything you'd like to take a bit further?
I would just like to say one thing. First of all, I would like to thank both discussants, Sam and Aikande, for their very complimentary comments on our work. I hope that the complimentary comments would make other people read the 3 volumes as much as any criticism would have. I would like to say something to Aikande. She's working on the relationship between church and society. I think Nyerere's policy on secularism, which is discussed in book 3, she may find interesting to read that more closely and carefully. It was a pragmatic choice, but it was a political choice. And in that, we are discussing the relation in Nyerere's attitudes to church as well as to Muslims. So that you might want to look at.
Thank you.
So, well, I don't have anything more to say. I think Sam, we have been involved in many debates on these issues, so there's not much more to say. And I must say that I would like to now take this opportunity personally face to face with the people who are participating, some of them and their writings and research we have used hugely in our book. For example, Andrew Coulson's writings on agriculture. You will notice that we have used it a lot in our book 3, Understanding of the Villagization Program, the whole role of agriculture sector, and so on. So once again, thank you all.
No, thank you as well. I'm really trying to wind up because we said we would end about now. But Saida, is there anything you'd like to say as a final word?
Yes, thank you, Andrew. Again, to thank the organizers for this wonderful discussion that we've had, but also to thank the comments, to thank the people who've commented on the book. And the interesting thing is that once the book came out, we've been getting all sorts of information from people, which of course we wish we had gotten before the book came out, but we hope perhaps we'll be able to use it in later editions. I'd also like to thank, as Issa did, all those who contributed to the book in the sense that we used their work, and particularly Mzee John Hatch, whom I'm meeting here for the first time. And I would particularly like to thank him at his instigation of TANU starting the women's movement. Actually, I think it was at his instigation that TANU quickly put together a women's movement that continues up to this day. So thank you very much for all your comments. It's been
and thank you as well for all your comments. You contributed very much to what we've said. I think I'd like to give
Andrew,
almost.
can you please allow me to make one comment? Andrew?
Yes, of course. Come in, sorry,
yes.
come in. I forgot to
I'm very sorry. Actually, this is something that we should have said right at the outset. But nevertheless, one person and one institution that I would like to thank, and I'm sure I'm speaking for other authors as well, is Mkuke Nyota, specifically Walter Bugoya, and much more Mkuki himself, Mkuki Walter Bugoya. They did a marvelous job. It was not simply a publisher's job, it was a job of someone who had his heart in it. And right from the beginning, the 3 of us had decided that we would like a local publisher. A decision that even Nyerere did not make. Nyerere's books were published by Oxford University Press. But we had decided that we would have a local publisher. And I'm so happy, and I'm sure the rest of us, both Saida and Gwanza, are very happy the kind of work that was done on the books and the quality of those books. It's very unfortunate. The books came out when the pandemic was raging, still is, and therefore its distribution has not been as widely as we would like to. But otherwise, I think we are very happy and thankful to Walter and Cookie for doing a marvelous job.
Can I add to that? I think the book looks great, and that so the design of it, which is in Cookie's specialism, is wonderful. But I also noticed that, yeah, thank you. Yes, there. If you've got Saida's picture, there it is. But I also noticed from the Cookie Nyanyota website that the book is not available. It's sold out in Tanzania, and I know that in Associated Africa Book Collective in Oxford, in England, they're also saying that it's flying off the shelves. So the book has created a great deal of interest. I wonder if Walter Bogoya would like a quick word about when we can, what about the publication process, and what is the plans of the publisher from now on? Because I very much,
I don't know where you got the, sorry, do you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you, Walter.
Okay. I don't know where you got the information that the book is sold out in Tanzania. It isn't. I wish we had sold out, but it isn't. We still have many sets of the book. And if African Books Collective are run out, we will send copies straight away. But I haven't received the report that they've run out. No.
No, that's sorry to mislead everybody. I only went on your own website and it said not available, so I couldn't see why it was not available, other than that it could have sold out. But if it's available, then in Tanzania, that's really important, and I'm sure there's going to be sales of that book. It's not going to you're going to sell the copies eventually.
I think there was an issue here. People wanted hardcover copies, and somehow, for some reason, everyone wanted a hardcover. Now, the hardcovers were a limited number. Those especially went to those who did contribute to the interviews with the authors. But the paperbacks, which are just as beautifully done, are there. They're available. But I understand that quite a lot of people wanted the hardcover copies. But the book is there, and if it does run out, which I hope it will do, we'll have a reprint very quickly. Thank you. And thank you, Issa, for the kind words you say about me and about my son, Mkuke, and about our company. But thank you also, because this was working with three extraordinary people, friends, comrades, and then people who are engaged in Tanzania's history and so on. So it was all a great company, a great job. So thank you very much indeed.
No, I mean, and good luck with the business side of it. Good luck with the sales. I did promise Sam the last word, and Sam, are you still with us?
I'm still here, enjoying the discussion. Let me also appreciate what has been written, what has been said, and the comments which have been made. I can only say one of the things which, in self-reflection, Nyerere said in the later years was that he was willing to give up socialism, but not self-reliance in terms of ownership of the economy and putting it in control of Tanzanians. That one he would not give up. But secondly, one issue which Nyerere is remembered for is as we are going into multipartyism, when 80% of the people interviewed said they were for one party, and only 20% said for multi-party. Nyerere actually almost forced the situation, saying, but the 20%, we need their views, and for checks and balances, they are important to respect. So he very much respected the opposition, even if they were the minority. But finally, Nyerere was very clear on the position of Tanzania and the third world in the global economy, and how we could position ourselves in the global context. He was always talking about that. And maybe I can add that to him, planning was to choose, and planning was not just an economic issue, but was political. That's why the second five-year plan was actually presented by himself in the National Executive Committee of the party, to ensure that the party actually bought or owned the plan, something which I think would be a useful lesson in the subsequent periods. But overall, let me say that I appreciate very much the presentations, the questions which arose, the discussions which came up, and congratulations to the authors and everybody who made a contribution. And also, as usual, coming up with path-breaking books in publications. Congratulations and thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew, and everybody else. Right.
Now, thank you, everybody. I'm going to make a suggestion, but maybe it would need confirmation from Janet Chapman that it's feasible. And certainly that ends our formal proceedings. But my suggestion is that those who want to stay around, unmute themselves and open the videos, and we'll see if anything is possible in terms of a few old friends saying hello to each other or making